get started, we've got some ground to cover, so let's.
You're welcome to join us.
And on the table is the PowerPoints from last week, and then there's a fill in the blank for this week that's on the table. Dave, could you maybe shut the door? Let me just pray for us, and then we'll get started here. Father, thank you for this opportunity to gather together here. We're about to peer into your world. We ask that you give us some discernment, some wisdom as we do this. Help us to glean from this what you would have us glean. Father, we thank you for this opportunity, and bless this class. Give us travelers' mercies as we leave. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, let me set the stage, and we'll do a little bit of review, but I want to kind of set more of a global type of view of all of this. So what we're about to do is look into God's world, God's creation. We're going to take the next 3 weeks and try to stay away from the real technical, but it's hard not to talk about things like DNA and the mechanics of some of the evolution. So we'll do that. But I want to just kind of center all of this. And so we're really going to talk about the natural sciences, the physics and chemistry. That's kind of the basis for all of that. And that feeds kind of all these ologies, the way we study stuff. So physics and chemistry kind of feed biology and geology and meteorology and ecology and zoology. All of that stuff that are fields of study. We use those fields of study then to look into our stuff. So in this case, we're using those fields of study to look into evolution, creation. So these are the fields of study. Now there are physicists and chemists, obviously. They're sort of the pure scientists, if you will. So that science is used here. Now, our stuff either comes from the earth or it comes through the earth. It either comes out of the earth or we grow it. So there's a saying that says it either has to be mined or it has to be grown, everything we use, right? Anything you use, whether it's all this, everything we're sitting on here, the fuel for your vehicle is mined from the earth. So it's either mined or it's grown. That's God's creation that he's provided, and we peer into that. And I like to use a little bit of an analogy when I start talking about the way we look into God's world, because we don't have a full view. And I don't know if anybody ever use a pinhole in a car to look at like an eclipse, right? Yeah. So I could take this laser and I can shine it through this hole. It's just harder to do, but you can get every once in a while, not everybody's going to see it, but I can shine it through here and I can get it to show on the wall. Okay, so when we look into God's world, when we look into creation, evolution, this stuff we're looking at here, I like to use the analogy. I'm sitting in the front row of a theater. I'm watching the most anticipated movie that I ever wanted to see, but I'm really looking at it through a pinhole. This is how I'm watching that movie. That's how we see God's world. We only have that little pinhole view, so we're trying to interpret these great big things through that little pinhole, because God's not revealed the whole picture to us. You know, we don't have 2 eyes stereo vision on all this stuff. You know, we're going to talk about fossils, we're going to talk about genes and all that stuff. Well, we're beginning to have some view into some of this stuff. So that's really where I want to set this next part of this session. We're going to spend 3 weeks on biology and geology. So we won't get through this whole session today. We'll pick it up, and we'll pick up the geology session starting tomorrow. We'll finish up the following week and all of that. That forms really the basis for our look at evolution and the way it hinges on creation. So let's kind of review where we are up to this point in the class. Remember, we're trying to look at how we think, not what we think. And it's an important point to this. It's not just, well, here's this interesting point, point, counterpoint, and all that. It's how do we think about all of that? We're trying to develop a process as we go through of how to think rather than what to think. So we've given a couple of tools, and for those of you that haven't been here, the first tool, what was that? Do you remember? Let me help you. Anchoring, right? So what is anchoring? See, I communicated well. Anchoring. It's just simply understanding worldviews. I'm talking to a person, I'm reading an article, I'm listening to something on the radio, whether it be pro-evolution, pro-creation, whether it be any point that, I mean, it's the, in a relationship, it's where are they anchored? That's anchoring. So that's an important thing to understand, is where are we with all of that? And the second tool, does anybody remember what we called it? The OI discernment tool, right? What does the O stand for?
Observation.
Observation, right. So we talked about what observations were. Remember what observations are?
The senses, would it be? The five senses?
Five senses, right.
Observation.
Well, it's something we experience
Take
with our five
phenomena
senses,
in,
right?
yeah.
And an objective observation was something that applied directly, facts, factual, right? Could be proven, measured. We also talked about what science really was. And where this really came into play was the I, right? Of the OI discernment tool. What's the I? Interpretation, right? So we observe something, but we interpret something from that. So when science applies the scientific method, they perform an experiment, they make observations, and then they have to interpret what that means. All right, so that's interpretation, that's not observation. That's somebody's idea of what's happening. We'll do a little bit of an exercise here today, maybe, hopefully we'll get to it, if not tomorrow, about how science looks at a particular fact. And then we need to understand the relationship between that objective observation and the interpretation. Just because I have 4 PhDs and I say this is what this means, it's still interpretation. It's the way I view it. Anybody in a relationship, a close relationship, knows that the two of you who've known each other for years may observe something and interpret it different. And that a lot is because of where your worldview is, where you're sitting, where you're anchored. Science tries to reverse engineer the nature of those rules that up here from what they observe. That's what science does. They try to reverse engineer it. It's God's rules. Science is just trying to reverse engineer what that means. The actual scientific truth about certain things tends to change as they become more fully understood. If you think back some of the stories you've heard about Greeks and all of that, and the flat world, and does the earth revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the earth? As we learned more, as we were able, more sophisticated on our measurements, opinions changed. So when you hear the term biology, what do you think? What do you think of when you hear biology?
Study of living things.
What's that?
Study of living things.
Study living things.
Yeah.
Science of life. And its name does come from 2 Greek words, meaning life study. Yeah. So when we talk biology and creation and evolution, what do you think of? This is not deep, right? What do you think of when you think creation, evolution, and biology?
The creation of life. How did life evolve?
How-
Okay,
Yeah.
I mean, that's it, right?
Changes that
Sure.
populations underwent.
That's, so we'll talk about some of the biological things as we go forward here. So, we wanna talk about the mechanics of this development, because, first of all, we can't go super deep with everything. But we really wanna talk about the hunt for the mechanics, okay? So, why talk about the hunt and not just look at the evidence?
What do you mean by hunt?
There isn't a lot of evidence.
Hunting for the evolutionary thing, why talk about, why do we wanna look into somebody hunting it rather than just start listing evidence?
I mean, transitional fossils, things like that.
Okay, if we can go hunt for those fossils, right?
There isn't very much that they found.
There's a lot, there's more than you think.
I think it's the motivation of the person looking.
Because that's right, we start getting into, we talk about, we're gonna go out and look, it's really, it's, what's that mean?
Interpretation.
Cause now the evidence begins to go over into interpretation. I find that fossil, and he used the word transitional fossil, how do you know it's a transitional fossil?
Because it has some characteristics of what we've seen as the earlier form,
Is that your
and
opinion?
some characteristics of a later form.
Okay,
And if you take a fossil and you say, well, is this a man or an ape? And then one person says, well, I think that's on the ape side, and the next person says it's on the man side. And there's no disagreement. That's a transition. It's right in the middle of the two.
if there's no, so, but we do, if somebody says that's an ape, this person is gonna argue, so it becomes interpretation of what that represents at the time. That's looking at the evidence, looking at how we find the evidence, looking at what we look at to do that, is really the how, not the what. And I wanna we can't help but look at evidence, right? What we got. But I wanna kinda look at the hunt and where it came from and what's happened with the hunt. So when we start talking about the hunt, oftentimes we talk about this guy. I know who that is?
That's Charles.
Darwin, right. What do we know about Darwin?
Not a
Hung out on
Christian.
the Galapagos
He was
Islands.
a Christian.
Well,
Everybody was a Christian back in the 1800s.
yeah, back in the day, I mean, there was, so what do we know about Darwin?
He was a naturalist.
Right, he's a naturalist. He went out and looked at nature,
Made up.
and he wrote this book, The Origin of Species. Now, I wanna point out what it doesn't say. It doesn't say the origin of man. It says the origin of species. So he was hunting for an explanation. Okay?
Can you explain, this is a sticking point people have, this is the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. This book didn't have to do with man, races were varieties, species, different kinds of plants. Those were, the old term, they used the term races. Nowadays, we're talking about ethnicity, and that is not what that means. And people say, well, Darwin was a racist because he talked about favored races. He liked some races better than others. That has nothing to do with that. It's a change in the language.
We're gonna talk about what triggered Darwin's thoughts. So, that's what I mean, I wanna talk about the hunt. So, what I wanna do here is do a little exercise. So at your tables, I want to go through an exercise on finches. So, I have
That was his thing.
Blank? The blank page?
So if you take a look at this, yeah, you can use for notes if you want, here's the exercise.
Oh, that's it.
All right, so what you have here is sort of a summary on the front page, of this book, okay? So in one page, we've tried to summarize the book, okay? On the second page you've got is from Berkeley, and this is from Berkeley, and it kind of explains natural selection in a nutshell. And then the exercise is here on the third page, where we'll talk about Darwin's finches. So if you could take a few minutes to kind of read through the summary and then read through the exercise, and then I'd like you all to tell a story on how you think we should analyze the work. Okay, we talked about some tools where people are anchored, observation versus interpretation. How do you reconcile it into your worldview? I'm not asking everybody to agree. I'm looking for more about how you think, not just why you think. Okay, so understand, I'm not asking you to defend or attack Darwin's conclusions. I want to know how or why you think about this. And then maybe when we're done, we can share thoughts. So let's take, 10 minutes. Now the Berkeley example there is not from Darwin. That's a modern day explanation of natural selection. Okay? It's just an example.
Diagram.
The Peter Grant thing about how long it would take to make the different changes, I think that's the Berkeley study. Is that what you're talking
Well,
about?
this is Berkeley.
This is-
Oh, that's
Berkeley, yeah.
Mm,
That's how Berkeley has a
really?
school-aged study of evolution, and they offer resources to explain evolution. This is one of those.
Oh, Berkeley okay.
So as you all finish, if you'll talk about how you feel about this, what's the story about how you would. So we had interesting conversation, so let me see if I can summarize our conversation here. And I'm gonna try to do this from neutral ground. I don't see any controversy here. This really is, this is very minor. Populations change. And over time, populations change. So how we think about that is that this appears to fit into a process of evolution. One point of view. Another point of view argued, primarily me, about looking at it from a worldview. If you accept it as evolution as true, then you look at it that way. If a staunch creationist said that didn't happen, they wouldn't necessarily have that same point of view. They would think about it different. Am I doing okay? And I'm not looking for great endorsement, I'm just trying to represent a little bit about what happened.
Yeah,
Okay?
I promised I wasn't gonna say anything.
No, it's okay, it's okay.
No,
It's what
it's
we're-
the best.
No, please
We're,
take.
we are not, we're not trying to right wrong, we're just talking about how we think about it, right?
No.
Okay.
I might not wanna hear what you have to say, go ahead.
No, we're glad you're here.
This table.
So you're asking us to talk about
How you think
how
about
we
it.
think about it,
How you think about it, not what.
right?
I'm not asking you to defend one side or the other, I'm talking about how you think about it.
So that this may or may not be content you're looking for. but we were just talking about how you look at the objective facts, right? And you can't help but separate your worldview from what you see completely, it seems like. You can make the observations that are factual, but we're already coming from a worldview. So you evaluate someone else's interpretation, understanding that there could be a lot of other information you don't have, right? That we were saying that when we look at this information, we just need to realize that even if it looks one way, there may be parts that we don't know or information we don't have. So we have to explore.
How about this table?
I'm not gonna say the right thing. Steve.
I think the illustration of Darwin's finches is not necessarily the process of evolution, but the process of adaptation. That species are selective, and so one particular characteristic gets emphasized simply because of natural selection, which doesn't necessarily mean there's such a thing as evolution where, a frog gets changed into a horse or whatever the supposed lineage is or something like that. But also this comes out of that period of time where people were concerned about observation and what happens on the basis of their observation. So if you look at botany, a lot of the classifications of plants were on the basis of the observation of leaf structure, bark, seeds.
Linnaeus, you're talking about Linnaeus, right?
Yeah. And so, but today, there's a whole host of changing of categories because we know at a molecular level, at a DNA level, how things are necessarily related.
Yeah.
And so you say this, if you simply observe the leaf structure, you'd say, well, this is related to that, but if you look at it from a molecular level, they're not the same at all.
So you're talking about genotype and phenotype. And once we had access to the genotype, we could see where Linnaeus was like, boy, he had a lot right. But then there were things that you can see where, well, no, that doesn't go here, it goes over here. Because just observing the physical appearance of things, he was amazing. It's amazing how much he got right.
Is that what you were gonna say, Sherry, or did you wanna?
Yeah, right.
I don't see anything that, this I think is gonna be how. I'm afraid I'm how I think and not what I think and not how I think, but I think there's nothing offensive in this article. It fits in with creation.
Okay.
I
I
went
think
through,
that's what I think.
this isn't really apples to apples, but I thought it was interesting over the last year plus with my work. I transitioned from something I did for 20 years to something I know nothing about. And part of why they asked me to transition was because they wanted somebody that wasn't tunnel vision, I guess.
Yeah.
And I've worked with people that are significantly smarter than me, but I'm also able to get them to take in a little bit, and it still will take a lot more time, but there's, like we talked about the opinions, the observations, we all look at things completely different. And, this unbelievably smart person over here and then this very simple, complex person over here, they may stimulate each other because they're gonna make different observations that a light bulb may go off, or there may be more than one way to do it.
Yes.
If that makes sense. So to me, that's been one of the eye-opening things over the last year is to realize that, we're both saying the same things, we're both ending in the same way, we may just get there different paths, or.
And I might spark something by saying something that I think is stupid, to a smart person, but it's just another way of,
Yeah, I just, I kind of agree with Steve and kind of what I've heard. If all you take is what is, if all we are to consider is what we've been shown here, I don't see where you would discern a person's worldview out of it, because it seems it could be compatible with either one.
Okay.
That's my thought.
How do you separate how you think from what you think? Like you're thinking of is how they're trying to standardize how we teach and how we grade, and it's all so subjective that we're finding it impossible. So like, you could look at any data, I mean, this is what I'm thinking as I'm going through this, I don't trust data because you can always twist it based on your worldview. So like, I don't know how you separate how from what.
Well, so that's how you think about it. I don't trust this data, so now I have to think about how I validate that data. Okay? If you think about something that just, the way I'm gonna decide what's right here is I'm just gonna take a poll and I'm gonna take that side, or I'm gonna go where I'm comfortable with people, cause it looks like the majority believes this, and that's how I'm gonna think about this.
Oh, okay.
That's one way also.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to say is we need to consider the worldview, the position of the author and our position, and recognize how we're going to interpret that versus how that author interpreted that. And we start talking about things that are mostly unseen. There's a lot of interpretation into that. The same data can be interpreted different ways. We did that exercise last week, right, with the picture. I mean, you all had the same data. It was very observable, but you came up with different interpretations of what was going on. That was kind of a silly example relative to interpreting the genome or astrophysical phenomenon. You know, that there's a different level of interpretation, but it's still interpretation of what we're seeing.
When you test things, I guess you can test it different ways. We always say test it to break it, you know, like a lot of people will test it to see, is this factual to what, like, you know, did our conclusion come to the same? And that's fine, because we're all following the same thing, but if you test it to debunk it, then maybe that's where I think Sarah's.
But remember, in this case, it's,
Yeah.
we're talking about where our faith and our reason might collide. And collision, remember, does not necessarily mean an opposition, it just means they come together and they exert a force on each other. So,
I was explaining the how, though, not the why,
yeah,
is what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say for Sarah, I think what Sarah's asking.
so there are times, this happens often to us, and we have mechanisms to get through.
Well, there's also the lack of information, you know, we have one page, and so we have, you know, you don't wanna draw quick conclusions with just limited information.
Mina, I'm glad you said that, because I just handed out another page, it's got 2 articles. We're still on Darwin's Finches. These are 2 articles written from the scientific community. I'm not gonna ask you to read the whole thing right now, I wanna give you the basis, I'm just gonna pull some stuff out, and you gotta forgive me for this, there's a lot of words. But what we wanna look at is, there's a summary of that first one, and they're back to back here, so it's both sides. But in this February 2015 study, okay, so now we're not talking about 1800s now. We're talking about real world study. That's it, Ron, right there. That's
Wait a
it.
minute, here.
Okay, good.
There should be, okay, so there's a summary in there that says, they're looking again at Darwin's, they're still studying Darwin's finches. So they inhabit the Galapagos and the Cuckoos, and they are a model that has been used for studies. So this is about becoming specialized here. So this is called adaptive evolution. So the conclusion here is they've now shed light on the evolutionary history of those birds and identified a gene that explains the variation in shape among the species, okay? It's an iconic model. They identified a gene that explains that variation. They've evolved into 15 recognized species. Now, they're saying species, right? How do we define species? Anybody have an idea?
It's very tricky, because there's a lot, if.
Make it simple.
Okay, well, if two populations that are very similar, but they can't interbreed, or
That's it.
if they can interbreed, it's sterile, like a horse and a donkey produces a mule, but almost all mules are sterile.
Right.
But you have ring species too.
So, but really, at the simplest level.
Yeah, at the simplest level, but
If two things can't make babies, they're different species.
it's more, it's more
Okay.
complex.
That's a
Yeah,
species.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're saying now there are 15 finches down there that can't breed back and forth and make babies. Okay? And the gene flow between them has played a prominent role throughout evolutionary history of Darwin finches. That's the conclusion of this article, through all this study. Okay? That's what's in there. Okay, now a quick sidebar, since we're in church. The first chapter of Genesis uses the phrase "after its kind," okay? 10 different times, and throughout Genesis it's used a number of times. It's used, so the first chapter there, God said, "Let them bring forth living creatures according to its kind." Okay, and then on the ark, we also had "according to its kind." Okay, what does kind mean? What?
That's the question, what is a kind?
Yeah.
And at what point can you not find a transition between one kind and another kind? That's the whole thing, is what is kind, and does it even mean anything in terms of?
So kind in the Bible is the Hebrew word mir, M-I-R. Mir doesn't have a direct translation into the English. And it means a number of things, okay? It depends on the context that it's in. So when the Bible uses "of its kind" or uses that, like kindred, okay? It means that it's a general biological category, or it could mean that it's a specific organism. So if you're Ken Ham, you look at kind on the ark, and God took two of a kind. If he was talking about the canine, he would have said that there were two canines on the ark. After the flood, they bred, and the wolves and the dingoes and all of that came from that kind. That's how he got all the animals on the ark.
Could you also say he took 4 of everything, 2 guys, 2 girls? Could you also be saying he took 2 guys and 2 girl whatevers, you know?
Well, I mean, but
Long time to be on both?
Ken Ham would say that there were two of a kind means that every animal we have today came from related kind. That's what he would say. So, again, MIR is a word that we don't have a direct translation for. So bear with me here. There were some more examples here. What I want to point out here is that it says, now we can safely conclude that interspecies hybridization played a critical role in the evolution of those finches, okay? Safely conclude that interspecies hybridization played a critical role in the evolution of the finches. That's what this study says. Okay, bear with me. Okay, so there's more here. You'll get this next week. And then at the end here, I would not be surprised, again, concluding, right? This is all from the study, it's not mine. Be surprised if it turns out that mutations with minor or minute effects on the ALX1 function or expression contribute to the bewildering facial diversity among humans. Okay, so what he's done now, or what the authors have done, is they said, this ALX1, which is part of the genotype, right, it's the, I'll show you a little bit about that in a little bit. Their conclusion is that you wouldn't be surprised if what he sees in the finches is happening in humans, okay? From his worldview, he's concluding as a scientist that what he sees in these finches probably is happening in humans. Okay, bear with me. Okay, the next article is later, I think it's 2017. Epigenetics may be how Darwin's finches rapidly change their beak size and shape in response to sudden environmental changes such as drought, human disturbance, and absence of gene mutations. So adaptive genetic mutations are so infrequent that this scenario cannot adequately explain the speed at which adaptation can occur. Okay, this paper is saying now what we had in 2015 may not be what happened. I see a different thing, okay, and it's epigenetics. So they've recently become aware that adaptation is not solely dependent upon genetic mutations. It can also occur through extra genetic mechanisms. Extra genetic means what? Outside of genetics, right? That's what that means. So this is another set of scientists 2 years later that's saying, nope, love your conclusions, but we're seeing it different. Okay. These are not Christian groups. These are scientists. Again, we're up in the natural sciences. Okay, so they looked at this, conclusion that epigenetic mutations, not genetic mutations, may explain it. Okay. So, recent research has shown that a wide variety of stressful environmental events can create epigenetic changes. In other words, that's what you were saying earlier, that stresses in the environment, other things can cause some of this to happen. So, you see what I'm trying to say here? There's two different studies, 1-2 years apart, that says, no, that's not it. We think it's this. Again, they have data, they've interpreted the data. Part of the scientific method. Okay. So let's think for a second as we go through this. Let me get to all of our stuff. Okay. Let's wrap up our finches. So let's try to observe several things from this kind of short review, if we can. Darwin said the offspring of an original pair of his opinion was, his interpretation was, and this is what he saw. And again, to give the guy credit, right? I mean, he was on a boat, he looked at these things, and he had this idea. And he said, offspring of an original pair of finches and natural selection responsible for the differences. Now, we know that no new genetic information was introduced in these finches. And it's sort of the same thing that we see in artificial selection. How do you make a cockapoo?
It's a hybrid.
Right? It's a breed now, right? It's a breed. Is it a different species than a cocker?
No.
Is a wolf a different species than a cockapoo? No.
They can have babies, right?
Well,
That's the
probably could.
Yeah, there's
Probably
one
wouldn't.
I think wolves are considered different than dogs, but they still can hybridize.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
wolf dogs,
So,
coy dogs.
but the limits to change here are set by the amount of information originally present. Okay? That's the limit to the changes. The finches did not introduce new information. They hybridized. See what I'm saying? So here's what happened. Okay? And this is just an example, you have this chart I gave you here. So let's just say that our group of finches had these 6 characteristics. Now, there were obviously more. I'm simplifying this. Again, I'm a mining engineer, I'm not a geneticist. I think in circles and lines, and I blow stuff up. So they could have either long or medium beaks, they could have either thick or thin beaks, and beaks could come out either black or brown. 4 of those potential permutations through there could be, right, that I have a finch that's born with a long, thick black beak, because that was the dominant gene that came through. Or I had a medium thick brown beak in this finch over here. But all of this information was already encoded into the finches that were there, because we weren't introducing new genes. They were being selective, and maybe it's because of the seeds that they couldn't reach, because the environment was dry, the seeds were now farther away, so the ones that died were the short beak ones. And the long beak ones were the ones that were able to reach the seeds, and they had a dominant long beak gene. So that's the finches that survive. So over a period of time, that's what became the dominant one. Now, there's opinions in the literature that says you take that same group and you start changing the environment again. If this encoded information goes away, they may not ever again get thick beaks, but if it's still in there, it may come back in, because it's already coded into the genes this way. And if it goes away, what we're doing is taking away information, we're not adding information. We're not developing a finch that, you know, has a characteristic not already coded in, right? You're not gonna make a dog out of a finch, because that's not encoded into the bird. Okay? So, one of the issues that we have as people who study this stuff, not me, but they have, is we don't have a viewpoint that's very long. You know, we're learning new stuff along the way, so we're taking that new information and trying to apply to our worldview, which may say, I know evolution is true, so I'm gonna I'm gonna interpret it in that way. There are people out there that know creation is true, and they're gonna interpret it in that way. So, how you think about that is understand where they're coming from, where you're at, and read it in that manner, being critical of the data that's presented, the way it's presented, and make that decision. Okay? I'm about to turn the page on the finches.
You know, my takeaway from this is amazing. I'm old, and I never thought about how Darwin was working through the information that I'm 60, in 62 years, I never thought about.
She called you older.
I never.
Thank you.
I appreciate this. I never thought about respecting Darwin because he was an intelligent man and used the information available at the time to come to a conclusion. It bristled me. And today, I guess that's what I've learned about how to think is, instead of bristling at Darwin, my first response should have been going back and trying to understand what he saw at the time. And not just what he said. And then accept more information as
I would tell you this story. Gregor Mendel was just figuring out heredity. inherited traits. And then, this is not DNA, that was in the 60s. But just the heredity with his P's, and tall P's and short P's. And just before Darwin died, Gregor sent him a thing that says, hey, I think I'm on to the how traits are inherited. Darwin knew they were passed from one generation to another, but he didn't know the mechanism.
Yeah.
Gregor Mendel said, hey, I figured it out. So he sent him a letter, and it was in his desk when he died, but it was in German.
Aw.
But so Linnaeus had one piece,
Yeah.
Darwin came up with another piece, Gregor Mendel was in here. So that's how science builds on itself. It takes what it already knows, and then sometimes it discards. He had theories about how the heredity worked, that's what you have now, you call it neo-Darwinism, it's basic theory, but with modern science and everything we've learned since then added into it. But I just like that story of Gregor Mendel's letter in his desk.
Wouldn't it be fascinating to have Darwin here to reevaluate all of the new data and see what he would come up
Oh,
with?
yeah.
Well, Rob, I don't know if it's true or not, but I always heard, I've heard that he wasn't as dogmatic about his theories
No.
as we are today.
No, and in fact, a number of his thoughts have been not discredited, but they've gone by. Yeah, he wrote a book, he had an idea about the origin of species, he saw these things and said, this makes sense to me. So there's Darwin on Trial is a book that if you're interested, read it. Written by a guy who's a lawyer, I think he's a lawyer who didn't, he wasn't necessarily a Christian as we would call a Christian here. So he was just in his 1800s, right? It was a long time ago. And we've got a lot more sophisticated processes today. If we can, the time we got left, I'd like to get through one thing here. DNA and RNA. Anybody know what DNA stands for?
Deoxyribonucleic acid.
Hmm?
Deoxyribonucleic acid.
Okay, how about
That's what I
RNA?
was gonna say.
Ribonucleic acid.
Oh, what are they? I can't hear. Oh, yeah, there it is.
Okay.
That's-
DNA has the information, RNA is what kind of carries that information. All right, that's part of our genes. So,
Oh, Mr. DNA, where did you come from? From your blood. Just one drop of your blood contains billions of strands of DNA, the building blocks of life. A DNA strand, like me, is a blueprint for building a living thing. And sometimes animals that went extinct millions of years ago, like dinosaurs, left their blueprints behind for us to find. We just had to know where to look. 100 million years ago, there were mosquitoes, just like today. And just like today, they fed on the blood of animals, even dinosaurs. Sometimes, after biting a dinosaur, the mosquito would land on the branch of a tree and get stuck in the sap. After a long time, the tree sap would get hard and become fossilized, just like a dinosaur bone, preserving the mosquito inside. This fossilized tree sap, which we call amber, waited for millions of years with the mosquito inside, until Jurassic Park scientists came along. Using sophisticated techniques, they extract the preserved blood from the mosquito and, bingo, dino DNA. A full DNA strand contains 3 billion genetic codes. If we look at screens like these once a second for 8 hours a day, it'd take 2 years to look at the entire DNA strand. It's that long. So, no. Well, that's where our geneticists take over. Thinking machine supercomputers and gene sequencers break down the strand in minutes. And virtual reality displays show our geneticists the gaps in the DNA sequence. We use the complete DNA of a frog to fill in the holes and complete the
science fiction. That wouldn't work. The timing, no, I'm just.
Okay, I want you to be honest with me.
People really think.
How
that-
many of you know what dinosaurs look like because of Jurassic Park? And how many of you know how DNA works because of Jurassic Park? So DNA, this is, we'll stop here, but I want you to think about something. Evolution is founded on the hypothesis that all species on Earth trace their ancestry back to a shared ancestor. That's what evolution's hypothesis is. So you realize that based on that premise, you share DNA with a worm. Just saying.
It's only logical.
We're gonna start next week by looking at information science uses to support this and how they come about it, okay? Any questions before we begin?
Saying with this slide, we all came from Arizona, is that what?
Do what?
We're all related somehow through Arizona?
I think we live
Arizona.
Saturday Night Live skits.
Okay? Questions, comments? I think it's a good place to stop
Down by
with
the
this,
river.
so.
Said I came from a van down by the river. So remember that skit right there?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.